everyone. Thank you for coming. This is Currents Presents. This is a lecture series that we organize through the Art History, and Film Department of contemporary makers and thinkers in art-related media. And we're really excited to have Nyeema Morgan here today, but we will get to her introduction in a moment. Just a couple of quick announcements. Our next Currents Presents speaker will be Professor Renee Pastel, who's from the communication department here. She's an assistant professor, and she works mostly in film theory and will be talking about fact-checking fiction and comparing historical events to how they are recreated in TV and film. Also, I hope you will join us this evening for our colloquial and lecture series. We have our own Professor Stephanie Leone speaking about the collective enterprise of Baroque architecture, the design of the Villa Pamphilj. I butchered that terribly, I apologize. Rome from 1645 to 50. And we have the Zoom link available on our website, and I can send that out to anyone else who's interested. So those are our very near and present events coming up, and I'm going to send it over to Hartmut to introduce Nyeema for us.
Thank you, Greer, and welcome to Currents Presents. Very pleased to welcome Naima Morgan, who is joining us from Chicago, where she currently lives with her family. Naima is an interdisciplinary artist who raises questions about how we articulate and construct meaning within a complex system of socio-political relations. Raised mostly in Philadelphia and Minneapolis to artist parents, she was exposed early to selecting and cataloging and editing imagery, objects, and written information, and the investigation of how they are used to construct meaning in order to, for example, establish power structures or to subvert them. Core to her practice is the discipline of drawing. This is how I became really aware about your work. But drawing is not necessarily a means of picturing objects or just mimicking nature, let's say, but rather much more like a mapping tool, questioning information's conceptual and hierarchical value. Naima earned an BFA from Cooper Union and an MFA from California College of the Arts in San Francisco. And she was also an artist in residence at Skowhegan. And her many exhibitions include most recently the stem, the flower, the root, the seed at the McMullen Museum of Contemporary Art, in which she brought together her core discipline with that of sculptural objects and printmaking. She also had an exhibition recently, titled Horror, at Grant Walquist Gallery in Portland, Maine, also not that far away. And there she presented object-like large monoprints that were framed together with these kind of, I think that these were rubber discs. Mm-hmm. She was also included in many shows all over the country and internationally, among them the Drawing Center in New York City, the Boudwin College in Brunswick, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and Gallery Generoch d'Art in Paris. So with that, I really want to turn it over to you because I'm so excited that you are with us and learning more about your whole discipline and how it's connected. So thank you very much. Please welcome Naima Morgan.
Thank you so much, Hartmut, for that. You know, you brought up something that was really important, which is drawing, which I consider to be central to my practice, even though I do a lot of sculptural work as well and some print-based work. And I do self-identify as a drawer primarily. Okay. And it's not so much, as you mentioned, about the kind of conventional representation of form. But, you know, when I think of drawing, I think of it in its most essentially as the delineation of space, you know? Oh. So it's the way I think as well, you know? I think about the boundaries, the borders, and the thresholds, you know? So that's how I'm kind of rooted in concepts around drawing. And I'm gonna start with a digital drawing. I decided what I would do is I would introduce you all to some of my work over the years in a somewhat chronological order, not quite. But what precedes all of my works, and they vary, they differ quite a bit, but what precedes them is a series of observations about the world and also questions that kind of prompt me to make these diverse works. So as I go through the images and introduce these projects, I'm going to share with you some of those observations and questions that led me through the work. So this image that you're seeing is a digital drawing titled 47 Easy Pound Cakes, like Grandma used to make. It's a series of 47 drawings. They are rule-based drawings that consist of my grandmother's easy pound cake recipe, as well as 46 other easy pound cake recipes that I found online. So here is one of the drawings. Like I mentioned, this is a rule-based system of creating the drawings where I'm typing in the recipes. It's basically a conflation of all 47 recipes. So I start with my grandmother's recipe, I type in the recipe, then I add the subsequent recipe. What you're seeing here are lines that negate words that don't belong in the following recipe, or that move words to a different position. So words that are in the first recipe that appear in the second, they just get moved to the appropriate place in the second recipe. So what's happening here is that it's kind of negating all of the recipes or the legibility of all of the recipes in favor of creating this new form. That whole process, rule-based process, was done 47 times to create 47 unique drawings consisting of the same information, the same material. This is an exhibition at the Bindery Projects in St. Paul, Minnesota. And here are some of those observations and questions that started the work off. So my grandmother's easy pound cake is the quintessential pound cake. All others are of lesser quality. Some of the questions that arose were, how do our lives shape our understanding and judgments about the world? I should say our lives and our personal experiences. How much variation is allowed before a thing is classified as something else? What is the variability threshold? I began these in 2007 in grad school. It was probably the single work that I made in grad school that I didn't think was atrocious, that I held on to and really was the beginning of a kind of thought trajectory and making trajectory for me postgraduate school. I completed these works, the whole series, in 2012. Each drawing took about 6 to 7 hours to make. So I was working on that amongst other works. And then I completed in 2012 and then started to exhibit the whole series of works. So this is at the CSS Bard Galleries in an exhibition called Signal from Noise in 2015. Moving from that work is a work titled Obviously God. That was done in 2012. This is unfired clay, metal brackets mounted on the wall. This was at the Drawing Center in a group exhibition in New York. Observations: language is porous and malleable, but specific and enduring. It's difficult to maintain integrity of discourse in virtual spaces. Some of the questions, or a question that arose was, when there are so many voices occupying a space, a virtual space, vying for attention and affirmation, how can we establish mutual understanding and build respectful space for participation? Here's a detail shot. So what you're seeing is an image of a screen capture of a message board on a political site. I was at one point, I was really obsessed with looking at these message boards late into the evening and the early morning, which it's probably the worst thing to do before you go to bed. It was just people engaged in these really horrible, kind of unproductive conversations, not even conversations, just arguments. So here is a bit of that image, a close-up of that screen capture. The conversation was led by a response to President Obama's national address when he was talking about our relationship to the Muslim American community at the time. It had angered a lot of people and started a lot of arguments, conversations. So this is a snapshot of the conversations from one of those sites, which begins with the statement, which I find really absurd. Obviously, God. You know, how do you start? How do you build a conversation on a statement such as that? So at the time, I was really interested in, and still am, interested in language, how we speak to one another in these virtual spaces, and dialogue and discourse, and how that's kind of structured or how it falls apart. This is an image just of the work, how it was built. So you guys can see here, everything was engraved in air dried clay. Like I mentioned, this is unfired. And then after it was bone dry, it was broken and reassembled in the exhibition space on the wall. So this is an ephemeral sculpture. I've had to make it twice already. It doesn't last the deinstallation, so it just crumbles and falls apart. So I believe this was the second, possibly the third time I made this work. And then I'm jumping forward to the recent show that Hartmut mentioned, The Stem, the Flower, the Root, the Seed, at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art. It was an exhibition that was slated to open during the pandemic. Thankfully, they wanted to continue with the year's programming, specifically because the guest curator, Rose Van Merlo, had organized programming, 3 solo exhibitions related to the centennial of women's suffrage, which was last year. So the museum wanted to keep that programming because of its significance in relationship to the centennial. So the exhibition still happened during the pandemic and was extended quite a bit. So it was from September to January. So, you know, when Rose first introduced me to the programming that she was doing and extended an invitation for me to have a show, you know, I was a little bit hesitant at first because, you know, the right to vote wasn't granted to all women. So that celebration, I didn't feel, I wasn't always a part of that celebration, you know. I couldn't share in that historical triumph with the understanding that it wasn't a right granted to all women. But when Rose shared with me the other programs that she was introducing, I understood that she was open to addressing the challenges of that issue. And so it gave me the opportunity to present works that would talk about power, agency, lack of agency, and other kind of relevant issues, problematic issues. There were several works in the show. I'm going to share images, some installation shots throughout the exhibition. To the left, you are seeing two works titled Soft Power, Hard Margins. These are 2 out of 7 that were in the show. I'm going to come back and talk about these because these were actually an offshoot of a larger body of 40 works, some of them that you can see behind me. So I'm going to talk about them in more detail at the end when I talk about those other works. And on the side here, you see a partial image of a fuller installation, a titular kind of installation titled The Stem, the Flower, the Root, the Seed. This is Soft Power, Hard Margins, 1973, 1976. 2 more details. And what you may be able to see, it's a little difficult because it's very discreet, that another work in the exhibition is called The Flower Number 4, which consists of text in white vinyl on the white wall. So it's very subtle. You can see it kind of above the pieces in the middle. You can also see it in the upper left. There's a piece of text there, and there's some also in between that's really hard to see. You know, it's best seen in person. It's something that you discover as you walk through the exhibition, as your body shifts and move through the space, and the vinyl, the light kind of hits the vinyl, and it reveals a lot of this hidden text amongst all of the works in the show. Here it is. You can see the flower number 4 in the upper left corner behind Soft Power, Hard Margins, 1964. So the works of Soft Power, Hard Margins in this exhibition is focused on the kind of seminal works of women artists in art history. And here is the installation, the main installation, the stem, the flower, the root, the seed. It consists of these very kind of crudely cast hands of women or people identifying as women holding these wooden staffs with a series of broadsheet newsprint papers draped over the staffs. And it's installed in a way that it makes an arc, and that when the viewer stands in the center of it, they're not completely surrounded, but it appears as if, you know, there are bodies around them holding these staffs out, which are positioned kind of at an average eye height. Observations: women's right to vote as the result of the suffrage movement didn't secure the right for all women. Questions: how do I make a work that embodies both offense and defense? How do I implicate the viewer? Here's a fuller shot. And then on this wall, you know, along the molding on the bottom, along the ceiling, everywhere on the wall is this white vinyl text, which is difficult to see in the images, in the photographic reproductions. So draped on the staffs are these newsprint sheets. They're broadsheets, the size of newsprint spreads, and they are multiples of the same print. And it's intended that the viewer would be able to take one of these sheets with them. On these sheets, on the inside, it's not revealed on the outside, but on the inside is a composition of text. Now, these are the same text, some of the same texts that are also printed on the wall. So these are stories about the lives of women, mythological, you know, fictitious and real, in the same space. So the texts that were on the wall, the vinyl texts, are some of the same texts here. So you see the one about the girl who married the sky spirit, the one about the queen beheaded for treason, the one about the woman who got her groove back, the one about the girl that got away, the one about the hooker with the heart of gold, the one about the abolitionist suffragist who escaped slavery, the one about the Virgin Mother, the one about the young, impassioned environmentalist who inspired a generation, the one about the teenage girl's existential reflection in the face of genocidal horror. Observations: stories about the lives of women are archetypical. How do the stories about the lives of BIPOC and queer women differ from conventional stories about women, womanhood, and femininity? So the majority of these stories I pulled from my own memory. And I was thinking about history as a series of significant stories. And we know about them because they're deemed significant, and they're extracted from a series of countless events that happen in the world. So this is a part of a bigger question where I'm kind of thinking about how those stories function in our lives. Here's a detail. The one about the girl deceived by a wolf. The one about the pagan martyr. Here it is as the flower number 4 in the vinyl, the one about the prophetic martyr who led her country to sovereignty. Again, another of the soft power hard margins, 1975. There's another shot, 4 out of the 7 pieces. Along the top is the one about the woman whose life typified the Georgian era, and the one about the entrancing femme fatale. Also in the exhibition was one out of a series of drawings that I've been doing since 2010, titled Like It Is. This is Like It Is, Extraordinary Women. I'll also come back to talk about these drawings when I introduce them through another exhibition that I had at Grant Wallquist Gallery. So here's a frontal image of that drawing. These are pretty large, 43 by 55 inches framed, pencil on paper. So in 2018, I had a solo exhibition at Grant Wallquist Gallery in Portland, Maine. If you're in the area, I highly encourage you to visit the gallery. The show was called Horror Horror and featured several works, some of the drawings from the Like It Is series, but also this piece titled Horror Horror, which are 4 large monoprints in a cherry frame. These are the proportions of a door, and these are rubber mats placed in front of them here. You know, Hartmut mentioned my family. I have 2 children, and so one of the many joys of raising the kids is that I get to sit and kind of watch the cartoons and revisit some of the things that I used to watch with them. So I used to love the Roadrunner, you know, the Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. And as I was watching it with my daughter and she's laughing hysterically, I was realizing how morbid this whole story is. You have the coyote trapped in this kind of perpetual death cycle, you know, trying to relentlessly pursue the Roadrunner, which he can never kind of get. And I guess I empathized a bit thinking about myself, you know, and my life and different pursuits that I guess we all have pursuits and these goals that we're kind of relentlessly kind of going after or have in front of us. And then it also moved me into thinking about my role as an artist and what it is that I want, what it is that I need, you know, from my work or from the art world. And then also thinking about history and art history, thinking about my place as a Black woman artist and how my role is kind of prescribed, or how I'm allowed to contribute, or how my contributions are rewarded or not rewarded, you know, within the field. So all of these are monoprints. The yellow here is actually hand painted, so there is a slight variation from one to the next, subtle variation here. Observations. Art history is a subgenre of history. History is a story that is inherently biased. It privileges certain historical facts over others, creating dominant and non-dominant narrative arcs. Questions. How does history as a story function allegorically in the present? Do we understand, read, make meaning of history the same way we understand, read, make meaning of fables, mythological tales, and etc.? Here's a detail. All 4 prints. Next in the exhibition, there is an installation titled Like It Is Prelude TM. So what you're seeing here are kind of 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper that were printed modularly and glued onto the wall. The text here from the image, the scanned image reads, I have a choice here between blanking about blank as blank is, or as blank seems to be and is generally thought to be. There isn't any great difficulty about it because both sides are fertile ground. The stories merely differ in plausibility. And this is from the biography of Thelonious Monk that I happen to be reading at the same time around the murder of Trayvon Martin. And so observations. During the public dialogue about Trayvon Martin's murder, different narratives about young Martin's identity were being pushed forward. The character of the victim versus the character of the murderer was deemed a significant arguing point in establishing justification of the offense. Questions. Why? Rhetorical question. Another question. How do we negotiate contradictory elements occupying the same space? Next, I'm coming back to the series of drawings. Like I mentioned, I started in 2010 called Like It Is. This one on the left is Like It Is, Extraordinary Popular Delusions. And on the right, is Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, #2. And you'll see, as with the previous drawing, that I showed, Extraordinary Women, that all of the drawings in this series have the word extraordinary in the title, but the subject of the books, of the literature that's being referenced is different. Also, present in these drawings, you have these kind of pretty tightly rendered representations of the title pages of the books, like the one on the right, which is more of a frontal kind of frontal image of that book. Later on, as I was working on these, I wanted to reveal the mechanism of reproduction. So I started to kind of skew the books on the scanner bed so that you can see the kind of black, that tonal value of the machine beneath it. And then later on, I started adding the incidental shadows that were in the space. This happened at a point where I was in a residency in New York working in the space, and there was very little light and it was casting really harsh shadows. And I was trying to work on these drawings at the time, and it was such a challenge and difficulty to get around the shadows that I just kind of had to throw my hands up and concede, and I just started drawing the shadows in the space. So that was the big turning point for these drawings. Here is another image. Pardon me. This one wasn't in the exhibition. This is Like It Is, Extraordinary Twins, but I wanted to add it as part of that group of drawings. This is in the collection at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. Here you have the shadow of myself actually as I was making the drawing. Also in the exhibition at Grant Wahlquist was this installation titled Untitled #1, I Rhinoceros. Observations. I make my art as a form of expression, a manifestation of ideas, thoughts, and questions intended to be received by an audience. I have no direct relationship to that audience. I am unaware of their needs and desires, but can only assume that they are similar to mine. Questions. Is there any reciprocity in the indirect interaction between artist and viewer? What do I require from them? What do they expect from me? So this was one of the first pieces where I started to think directly about that kind of relationship between the kind of giver and receiver. So these are castings of my own hands holding these vessels, which are found objects. I found these in my studio complex when I lived in Brooklyn. There were a lot of manufacturers around, and they were discarding a lot of these vessels. I mean, there was a box of maybe 100 of them by the dumpster. These very mass-produced objects, but also referencing these antiquities with these classical motifs. And I believe I have a few images of those as they're being made here. Those are other hands that weren't used in that sculpture. It's the painting of the hands here. So now I'm coming to the work, my most recent work that I've been working on this probably for a year and a half, all throughout the pandemic, called Soft Power, Hard Margins. I was working on these. I started working on them before the exhibition at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art. And just to give you a little bit of more information about that. The whole project was inspired by writing by the artist and philosopher Adrian Piper, who in an essay that she wrote in 1983, which is published in her book, Power Out of Order, Out of Sight, the chapter, Power Relations Within Existing Art Institutions, she wrote, and maybe I should give a little context. So she wrote this statement in response to a controversial exhibition by a white artist in New York in the late 70s who had a racial slur in the title of his exhibition. So this was her kind of written response to that situation, and her writing generally on the politics of institutions and accountability. So she said, secondly, the fight, I'm sorry, it should be the right. Secondly, the right to freedom of expression is a permission granted by the state to engage in certain activities, but not everything that is permitted is required, nor can everything that is permitted be justified. Third, the right to unlimited freedom of artistic expression in any case can only have application to a legitimate subject of rights. We normally grant such rights only to fully mature and responsible adults who understand in some sense the difference between right and wrong, and who can be relied upon not to abuse their freedom. So at the time that I was kind of thinking of some vague notions related to art history, artistic legacy, and authority, I had reread some of Adrian Piper's reading, and these statements really stood out to me. And I began to think about these seminal works of art, and the permission, the authoritative permission that they're expressing. So I started to write them down. I started to make a list of these many different works and write down that kind of permissive kind of expression through the works. So observations. The history of art relegates the contributions of Black artists to a narrow field of influence. The experiences of people of color are not considered universal, but are peripheral. Questions. How are American ideals of freedom, autonomy, patriarchy, transgression, and etc. reinforced through sanctioned culture works? What is the hierarchy of legibility between image, object, and text? So my interest in art history, of course, stems from me being an artist, but also thinking about my position. In graduate school, I was often answered the question, how do you see yourself in relationship to art history? And I always felt like I was on the outside of that, or that I wasn't an inheritor of the great kind of cultural legacy of impressionism or a modernist kind of abstraction or anything like that. But that artists of color our area of influence was relegated to this position over here of Black art, and that's what I operated within. So here's one of the pieces from Soft Power, Hard Margins. What I did was I started to make a list of these seminal works of art, the ones that you would find in any history book, right? And then start to write down that kind of, think about and write down that permissive kind of expression. Throughout history, thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of works have been made, but there are only a few that are kind of plucked from all of those works as being significant works. And so I'm always thinking about, how a work of art can kind of transcend the significance of the era that it was made, and what is that place it holds in this contemporary moment for us. how do we understand it functioning in the present moment? And then I also categorized that list of works into 3 groups. So there was the first group, which is the number of works that occupy space in the public consciousness, the works that your mother or your grandmother would know, the Mona Lisa, David, those works. And so there were actually probably you could probably count them on both hands, those number of works, where you ask someone on the street, name artworks, and then the second tier were also probably works that were recognizable, but maybe people couldn't quite identify the name. It could be Christina's World by Andrew Wyeth. They would recognize the image, but maybe not the title or the artist, but that image made its way into our cultural kind of consciousness as well. And then the last tier of works were the smallest works. And I mean smallest in size, because as you'll see in later images, there are 3 sizes representing those 3 tiers. The smallest works are the avant-garde works that are only really recognized by people, by patrons of the art, or by artists, by art historians. So that would be, Ankawara. It would be some Yves Klein, works. So it would be Duchamp, So those are the avant-garde works that aren't really publicly recognized by the masses, but are still considered significant, important, kind of game-changing works. So this is one here, Soft Power, Hard Margins, 1981. Soft Power, Hard Margins, 1974. Soft Power, Hard Margins, 1953. This is an image just from my studio here, so you can see some of the various sizes. I'm still working to complete these, so what you're seeing right now are the smallest and the middle-sized works. $19.90. Oh, sorry, that's not $19.90. This is mislabeled, I'm sorry. Soft Power, Hard Margins, 1915. These are all cast. I sculpted the frames, and then I cast them in resin. And they're all kind of, as you can see, they're kind of illuminated on the inside with these LEDs, these kind of marquee LEDs. Soft Power, Hard Margins, 1948. Here's another image of some of them. I'm sorry, that's a little blurry. So there are about 40 of these in the series. And I'll be showing these all for the first time, all 40, in an exhibition in May here in Chicago at an artist-run space, a space of a dear friend of mine. And they'll be displayed the same way they were in the images that I showed you, kind of salon style, floor to ceiling. Possibly on the ceiling. We'll see how it all fits in the space. And then a few additional works. This is some drawings. As I mentioned at the start of the talk, is that drawing holds a core kind of position in my practice. So when I'm working on a lot of these works are very labor intensive. So as I'm working on them, when I have to step away from other works, I always return to drawing. So these are, this is one out of a series of drawings that I have been working on. They're untitled at the moment. They're part screen print, drawing. And what you're seeing here, you have this kind of square color field. these screen print images here on the top. And some of these other images, these cloud bursts and these motion marks, which are also kind of harkening back to the Warner Brothers kind of motion marks or gestures, the puff of clouds in an explosion or something like that. Or the marks of the Roadrunner, or the coyote as they're running. And then here, the text, the white text that you're seeing kind of in an arc at the bottom, it's a reference to fairy tales and fables, which you saw in the larger work, Horror, where it said the one about the three pigs. So the text is broken up, again, also like it is in Soft Power, hard margins, as a way to really slow down our reading and to draw attention to the process of reading and making meaning, rather than being something that's done very automatically without much consideration of it being a process. And then the text block that you're seeing on the upper right, it's the name of all the African-American artists that I can think of, past and present. So a lot of my colleagues and also a lot of people from the past as well. Here's a close-up here. Noah Purifoy, Ayanna Moore, Devin Mays, Ernest Bryant. And what's happening in all the drawings is that, it's hung kind of askew like this, because the text field is what is level to the ground. So in all of the drawings, it's oriented so that the names are parallel to the ground there. Observations, again, history and the history of art relegates the contributions of Black artists or Black people to a narrow field of influence. Questions, how can I think about the diverse lineage of African Americans, working conceptually, working representationally? How can I think of us, or how do I think of us as a collaborative kind of unified body? So here, a kind of form of representation of all of us as an element in the drawing, negotiating space, occupying space with the other kind of visual elements. That one reads the one about the tortoise and the hare. And that is it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Naima, thank you.
Thank you.
Just
Thank you.
amazing. Yeah.
If you would like to ask any questions, we do have a couple minutes. I know some people have to run to class, but does anyone have questions for Nyeema?
Hi, Naima. Thank you for sharing. I was just wondering, like, for some of your art, like the horror ones, it says this one, the story about the three little pigs, and then the recent one you showed, it said like the story about like the hare and the rabbit.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, why you chose those specific titles and what they mean.
So thanks, Sunny. So why did I choose the specific titles for those works, or why did I choose those specific fables?
The fables.
Oh, yeah. Well, I just showed an example, just a small example of some of the drawings that use the names of different fables. So there's a lot in my other works, a lot of other fables that are referenced as well. The one about the steel driving man, I have a whole list of those that I bring into different works at different times.
Got it. And then they're just like for like the overall concept. Like, is there a way you choose like which fable to use, which work?
Not particularly. I mean, it really happens. It happens in the moment as the drawing is being built, and some of it is just a formal issue of just like when I break up the text or how I compose it, like how it will fit, within the image, along with other elements, print elements, other marks. It really varies. It depends.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sunny.
Kevin, were you gonna ask a question? I thought I saw you do this.
Yeah, is that okay, or did someone want to go? Should I do it? Okay.
Yeah.
Please.
Naima, thank you so much for that presentation, and yeah, just thank you. That's all. I have a couple questions. Maybe one of them sort of follows up on what Sunny just asked, but anyway, can I ask two, and then maybe you could choose the one you like?
Yeah,
the first one has to do with the Roadrunner. You made me like remember my own childhood too, where I was obsessed. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. You're breaking up a little bit, but I can still hear you.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm having internet problems in my apartment these days. Sorry about that. But I remembered that too. You made me remember those times where I would sit on the floor and watch the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, and the violence of those cartoons. I totally hear what you're saying. They're so ridiculous and crazy. So my first question was like, maybe you could say more about that, because it is true that the coyote is constantly dying and failing, right?
Yeah.
But he's also immortal, right?
Yeah.
He never actually dies. He always recovers and comes back to life. So he's not human in that way. He's always like recovering. But so I kind of feel like torn about that. But anyway, the other question has to do with your drawing practice, and which I was totally fascinated by. And the way you described it as delineating space or making connections or something. My question had to do with, like, do you ever think about the diagram as a kind of drawing that mixes drawing, text, and the world and space, right? A diagram is something that instructs us on how to build or make space, and mixes drawing, language, etc. Do you know what I mean? And does the diagram, is that like a way of drawing that you think about? Diagrammatic drawing?
Diagrammatic drawing. I mean, I'm not thinking about them so much when I'm making my work, but I do look at them. So maybe subconsciously, I am thinking about them, but probably more as a way to structure information. When I think of those diagrammatic, drawings, like how information is structured and kind of organized, which is what I was talking about before when I was thinking about drawing. And, at its most basic, I describe it as like the delineation of space with the mark. And that, that's kind of the way that I understand or perceive of the world, or even when I look at things. So for example, this is my kind of own idiosyncratic way of looking at things. But when I look at the world or my desk, I actually see edges and boundaries more prominently than planar surfaces. Like for some reason, like I'm more drawn to those thresholds where like something ends and space and another space begins, or something else begins. So those edges, those contours are really distinct to me. So going back to what you're saying about the diagrams, I guess there is something about them that resonates with me, because it's a way, like I said, of organizing and structuring information, whether it's a pie chart and things are kind of cut in this way and represents this kind of quantity here, And then about the Roadrunner, like I said, I just felt really kind of empathetic because, as an artist, which most artists, you kind of toil over your practice, I'm a failure, I'm this, or, and there's this kind of imposter syndrome, that kind of happens that you experience. So watching the Roadrunner, I was just like, oh my God, my life, what am I doing? And then also even more so kind of with the pandemic, this feeling of being trapped, So even in my own art practice, there are moments of feeling trapped either by, my own ways of working and habits that I'm trying to break free from, or just trappings of and machinations of like the art world, So that I really responded to the Roadrunner and that in that way, this kind of relentless kind of pursuits and and fixating on failures and things like that, you know.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple more questions. Do we have time?
Yeah.
I don't really have a question, but just it was good, great to hear you talk. So thank you so much. And hearing you talk about contours and edges, like looking at your work there, texture comes across so strongly, and I really get a sense of touching just through looking.
Yeah.
And it's so beautiful because we're so starved. I'm in Ireland, everything's closed. I can't go to any gallery, so I feel like I'm getting a really strong sense of that through looking. And it's so nice. I love that piece with like the newspapers.
Oh yeah, yeah.
The root,
the stem, the flower, the root, the seed. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's so beautiful. And then just out of interest, like how is that, like touch is so taboo right now, and to pick up the pieces during the pandemic, was that difficult to navigate?
A little bit, but mostly from the institution's, you know, position. They were kind of worried about that, you know. And yeah, it's you know, I'm the type of person, I'm really into texture as well, and I like to touch things, and anytime I can interact with a work, that's wonderful. So you know, it's unfortunate that the show happened during the pandemic, but I'm grateful that it did happen, and that there were, you know, people that were able to see it and take some of the works away, you know, with them, because it was meant for that. Those, you know,
such a nice thing.
Yeah, the broadsheet of the flower was printed in a large quantity so that people could have it and take it. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful work. I feel too, there's so much texture in your work, especially with the drawing pieces. Feels like there's so much memory wrapped up in it. Like I keep trying to draw more out of it, and I think you're doing it brilliantly. It's gorgeous work. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Jane.
I have a small follow-up question to that, because I am very interested in how you're dealing with ephemeral objects in the archive, and then like histories. And I love the broadsheets because also of I mean, you're hiding the message at first. You actually have to interact and look at it. And even then you're talking about this discursive memory about these women, right?
Yes.
Can you speak more? And like, also, I just love the idea of like your grandmother's pound cake from the very first like piece of like, that's a true history just as much as these integrated histories. So can you talk about your relationship to ephemerality and history and what we should know, and like questioning people's relationships with that?
Yeah, and I think those two examples that you mentioned, they're important because they touch on, I guess, my attempt at reconciliation, you know, in different ways. So the ephemeral and the ephemeral and the durable, the long lasting, like, you know, also with obviously God, the unfired clay piece that kind of falls apart and doesn't last. I have a background kind of in sculpture, and I did a lot of work in fabrication. And so, you know, I'm always trying to integrate into my practice or my work ways to break free from certain comfortable ways of working for myself. So a lot of my work is very labor intensive, you know, very tightly rendered kind of drawings, which is wonderful, but it's also, it also seems binding. So I'm trying to introduce ways to counteract that. So with obviously God, with that very detailed kind of engraving, allowing it to just completely fall apart, you know? Yeah.
I loved that piece particularly because we wish what we said on the internet would fall apart, and that's forever too. So I was thinking about that in context to that piece.
Yeah, yeah. And so, you know, like I mentioned with that, for me, I guess I'm trying to reconcile, maybe not through the work, but just in my own head, these contradictory elements. So how malleable language is, but how kind of impactful it is, you know, and strong it is at the same time. you know, my grandmother's pound cake being to me this quintessential definition of this thing, which is true, versus these other variations that are also true, you know, and how they can kind of coexist together in the world, you know, in the same space.
We could talk about that all day. Is there any last question
Yeah.
you have? So we don't keep Naima forever.
I just wanted to say it's such a special treat also to be able to look into your studio and that you share with us as well, because while you are working so poignant with word and language and in a way with conceptual things, you also are really a hands-on person, and the evidence is right behind you, which is I love. You seamlessly switch between the digital realm and the handmade realm, the analog. Abstraction and figuration, that is also what I really enjoy, that you take cast of yourself. I mean, really classical in a way. So there's really this kind of blurring also of like historic techniques and methods with something that's really cutting edge of today, contemporary. And so there is a kind of I wonder, do you have a certain hierarchy that you set in your own practice in a way? Is there something that you prefer over another? I mean, you mentioned the drawing is very integral to everything you're doing, but is there something, is that somehow driven by the ideas for your bodies of work that you're creating, or do you go more also with the flow, let's say?
It's all of the above. I mean, I consider myself, I do consider myself a conceptual artist, but also there's a strong kind of material practice that I must engage in, you know, and this work is made manifest through these forms and these different materials. And the questions that I have aren't just, you know, theoretical larger questions, but they're also questions for the material as well, you know. In soft power, hard margins, there were some of the pieces that you saw where the resin kind of spilled out of the mold and you could see the flange of resin. So it wasn't just the piece. So that was just kind of acknowledging the production process, that kind of fabrication and modern kind of fabrication processes, you know, of the mass produced. So making sure that that's also in the forefront is also important to me, the handmade and the kind of mass produced.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Any more questions, anybody, or comments? Or we want to say we recorded this and it will be posted also on the McMullen website, where I'm sure many more people will see this talk and watch this. So I want to thank you again very much, Naima, for spending time with us this afternoon. It was really a tremendous treat.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Greer. Yes, virtually.
Everyone. Okay.
Thank you, Naima. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was great.
Bye-bye.
Very well.
Thank you.